So we could tell when there's race riots occurring because there's videos of it. We could tell that there's arson occurring domestically in the country, especially on the railroads, because there's plenty of videos of it. We see lots of evidence that the people within Russia are not happy. Within Russia itself, we see there's increased tensions, increased fighting, especially within the oligarchy. We see that happening right now with Dagestani politicians who are currently in the Russian government, and they're at odds with Kadyrov, who's the head of the Chechens. And the fact that this has become so public and that the fighting is not being hidden is an indication that the situation is becoming really serious in Russia. Putin, historically, one of the key roles he played for the oligarchy was to be the keystone. Everybody relied on him. And all of the pressure was on him in the end, but he was the reason that they didn't fight with each other, because he was moderating what occurred. But we see he stepped back from that role. It doesn't appear that he's fully aware of the fact that things are getting so much worse, and that the fighting amongst the oligarchy could very well turn bloody at any point.
Before that, please be sure to hit the like button. Some of our videos do run the risk of being disliked by Putin's bot, and your likes help us out tremendously. Welcome everyone. Today we have Jason J. Smart back with us. He was our first ever guest and now he's first ever repeat guest. He's a special correspondent at Kyiv Post. Welcome and good evening.
It's great to see you again.
Perfect. So we'll just jump right into it. So this morning you shared a report on problems Putin's regime is facing, especially economic problem that is leading to infighting within oligarchs and that could force Putin to withdraw from Ukraine. Do you want to share a little bit more about that report?
Sure. There's a few things going on inside of Russia right now that I don't think get nearly enough press in the West. One is which the Russian economy is a total mess right now. Russia claims that its economy is growing, but it's actually hiding a sinister fact. Real inflation today in Russia is about 27%, according to Professor Hankey at Johns Hopkins University. In addition to that, Russia's economy is really tied to oil and gas. So much so that what's going on now with the OPEC plus situation, Saudi Arabia said that they're going to start producing oil at higher volumes in order to drive down the price to punish those countries that didn't maintain the $100 per barrel goal. But Russia's national budget is predicated on having $72 per barrel. And it looks now that the price might drop as low as $50 per barrel. That would make Russia have significant deficits, and they'd have to devalue the ruble. How much? There's estimates that the ruble be devalued to maybe 122 or 135 per dollar. So just imagine, Russians would have about, say, 22, 35% devaluation of their currency, plus inflation at 27%. Those are pretty significant domestic problems. And at this point, Russia's not doing nearly enough to slow it down. The central bank has continued to keep increasing key interest rates. It's now at 21%, but it was at 8% for a long time. The government was giving out mortgages like candy. And now it's created a huge bubble in the mortgage industry, which will, like all bubbles, eventually bust. So I think there's a lot of economists now watching the situation in Russia and realizing that things could turn upside down really quick. Within Russia itself, we see there's increased tensions, increased fighting, especially within the oligarchy. We see that happening right now with Dagestani politicians who are currently in the Russian government, and they're at odds with Kadyrov, who's the head of the Chechens. And the fact that this has become so public and that the fighting is not being hidden is an indication that the situation is becoming really serious in Russia. Putin, historically, one of the key roles he played for the oligarchy was to be the keystone. Everybody relied on him. And all of the pressure was on him in the end, but he was the reason that they didn't fight with each other, because he was moderating what occurred. But we see he stepped back from that role. It doesn't appear that he's fully aware of the fact that things are getting so much worse, and that the fighting amongst the oligarchy could very well turn bloody at any point.
The Saudi situation, I know Saudi and Russia have been a little bit at odds over the oil production. So why is Russia not following the OPEC guidelines, I guess? Wouldn't they benefit from higher oil prices? Like, what's their dilemma?
So Russia is an interesting situation. It has already said that it plans on producing less oil to make up for these grievances that Saudi Arabia has. But the fact is, Russia for all of 2022, 2023, and most 2024 has been trying to figure out where they can get money from. They just don't have a lot of options. With all the sanctions, Russia is really limited. And getting rid of oil, selling off oil, is the best option they have. And so they're continuing to do that. It's become much more challenging for them due to the fact that it's not being done legally in many cases, but they are still selling huge amounts of oil.
Mm.
And it's one of the only solutions they have of trying to come up with cash.
I guess switching back a little bit the focus, we've been seeing a lot of reports about the civil war between the Chechen leader and the Dagestani billionaire. How big of a threat is that to Putin? How big of an issue that is? And yeah, how's that progressing, the civil war?
So within Russia itself, there's a lot of tensions. For one, we have the problem with Kadyrov, the head of the Chechens, who's fighting for taking over a major company in Russia that's worth hundreds of millions of dollars. But at odds with him are people that are in the Russian government from Dagestan. They don't want to see Kadyrov coming in and taking away business, and the fighting that's breaking out between them looks really serious. But more than that, within Russia, there was some significant race riots just last week. In Chelyabinsk and other parts of the country, we've seen it. There's just breakouts of different types of violence. But also, we saw just last week in Chechnya itself, where somebody began to fire on Russian troops that were stationed there. So within Russia, there's a lot going on that are indicative of the fact that things are not going so well in Russia.
I guess also the Russian media doesn't want to report in this too because there's thinking that it could lead to more like more violence and more people getting the idea if you report on what's going on inside Russia.
Russian authorities obviously try to keep down the fact that things are not going well. They like everybody to believe that Russia is just doing great, that people have a great quality of life, but we know that's simply not the case. Given the fact that a lot of things, thanks to Telegram, people post videos when things happen. So we could tell when there's race riots occurring because there's videos of it. We could tell that there's arson occurring domestically in the country, especially on the railroads, because there's plenty of videos of it. We see lots of evidence that the people within Russia are not happy. And a lot of people might think that the Russians are very placid and they're not going to stand up ever to Putin. And I agree. I don't expect some sort of massive protest in the country, but to assume that people support the government is simply false. And we know that from a lot of different things. We can see it in Yandex search results, Google search results, but we can also see it in, for instance, last year when Prigozhin, the head of the Wagner group, went into Rostov. And when he got to Rostov, we noticed that the people did not, say go back or don't overthrow the government or we love Putin, we support him. No, the people brought him food. They brought wine to his soldiers. They brought water to his soldiers. They greeted them as heroes. And that's probably a very bad sign when a city, which is the home of Russia's Southern Command, the military center from which the war in Ukraine is waged, those people are supporting the people rebelling against the government. There's a lot of indications that within Russia, there is something teeming under the surface, which we don't see so well from here, but something that could dramatically change what Russia is doing at any time if it starts to boil over.
Also, the riots that are happening in like the ethnic Russian regions. I know we know that a lot of the soldiers are coming from that region, and a lot of the soldiers are dying. I wonder how much those go hand in hand. Is that having any effect, or is that boiling over?
The fact is that Russia operates like a colonial power. So, technically, of course, everybody who is in Russia that's a citizen should be treated equally. But it doesn't really work out that way. For instance, Buryatia is a great example. The Buryats are a small group of people. There's perhaps 550,000 of them total in the world. But they have a region they live in called Buryatia, which, if you're from there, you're 75 times more likely to die in the war in Ukraine than is a guy from Moscow. So, why is that? Well, the Buryats are one, Asiatic looking, two, they're Buddhist. And so, for the people in Moscow, they seem distant. They're almost like foreigners. And in the eyes of the Russian government, they're much more expendable than the ethnic Russians, who Vladimir Putin is very afraid of upsetting them.
Now, we'll talk about actually North Korean soldiers in just a second, but before that, I've read some reports about Russian moms actually forcing Putin to negotiate for like the prisoner swaps, especially the soldiers that were caught by Ukraine in the Kursk region, because they were not expecting to get caught by Ukrainians, right? And I don't know if there's a similar comparison where before the Soviet Union collapsed, it was the Russian moms who started the protest against the Afghanistan war. Is that like just drawing similarities where there's nothing same, or is that could be a sign of something big coming?
So Russian mothers have always been active. And actually, that's probably pretty universal. It was true in the 80s, it's true in the 1990s, and it's true today. And it's very hard to get mad at them. And the government does not use all the force it could against them because it looks just simply bad when somebody's out there saying, bring my son home, and you put them in jail. So the government has to have some sort of a moderated response to them. But overall, it does draw more and more attention in the public to the fact that Russia is simply not doing nearly as well in the war in Ukraine as it likes others to believe. And the fact that almost 1,000 square kilometers of Kursk Oblast, Russia, is currently under Ukrainian occupation is stunning. And even for Russians, it's hard to believe that Russia now is on the receiving end of occupation.
Yeah, Putin became the first leader to be invaded since World War II.
Yeah, not the 3 day war he was hoping for.
Yeah, that's true. Okay, I guess the big news now. North Korean troops are in Russia, and recently North Koreans kind of confirmed it. They're like, we have every right to send our troops. Putin confirmed it, saying it's his business. But I guess when NATO wants to send troops or NATO wants to help Ukraine in any way, that's Russian business too somehow. So yeah, what are your thoughts? Like, how big of an escalation this is? I think just before we hopped on the call, NATO confirmed it too, which was the first confirmation from them.
So the North Korean troops in Russia right now, there is a question of what they're doing there. And it's obvious that they're there to assist the Russian military, but really how? So there's some who think that they're being sent there for the meat waves. And I totally disagree with this. I think it's very unlikely that North Korea would send 10,000 men to just get shot up. And there's a few reasons. One, Russia in a lot of hot areas can lose up to 1,000 people per day. So just imagine Pokrovsk, which is in eastern Ukraine. Russia is losing, injured or killed, about 1,000 men per day. So if there's 10,000 Koreans, well, in a week and a half, they'll be gone. That's not a great investment for anybody. But there's another thing, is that I think it's much more likely that they're coming to do technical assistance, for instance, with the missile systems, some of which North Korea has experience with, or missiles that come from North Korea, or they're coming there to learn how to do warfare, especially as the winter now is beginning. North Korea hasn't had an active war since the end of the Korean War. So it's been over 70 years. Right now, they're trying to gain as much experience as possible to understand what real life warfare is like. And so I think it's much more likely that the North Koreans are there to assist with technical questions rather than to be simple infantry and cannon fodder.
What about China? The BRICS just ended. Is China unhappy with North Koreans being in Russia since the war is expanding? That's probably going to hurt China's, I guess, economic availability.
It's hard to imagine that China is excited to see that North Korea has decided to get more involved with Russia. Now, at the same time, it does perhaps give China an opportunity. And the reason is that China can act like the broker between the West and the North Koreans and the Russians. They're sort of uniquely qualified for that role. So I think if we're looking at what China's trying to do, especially in light of the fact that they've been talking more and more about Taiwan, perhaps they're thinking that they can play the role as being the critical peacemaker in Asia. That is, through them, there could be stability. And without China, there can't be. So I do think that China probably has a strategic goal with this, but what that is, we don't yet see.
Also, just a little bit earlier, you bring up Prokhorovsk. And I think last time we talked about how Russia is a mafia state. And I was watching one of your videos, which, by the way, I'll link it up there and down below. And you bring up some interesting points that I don't actually see even on Twitter. And one of them was the mine, coal mine. And yeah, like it's not really about just a land grab. It's really like good old imperialism.
Throughout this war, we see that Russia has had one thing that it does all the time, and that's to get as many natural resources as possible. Now, it's not limited to Ukraine. Russia does exactly the same thing in Africa, for instance. But in the case of Ukraine, it's pretty stark. So in 2022, when the invasion began, and you look at it on a map, and you look on a map at the same time, where are Ukraine's most important natural resources? There's an overlap. And why there's an overlap is Russia wished to take control of Ukraine's natural resources and their industrial base, hoping that without that, Ukraine would be broken. But also, it allowed Russia to corner the market with various goods. Russia was doing all it could to mop those up and take control of those. And an example that we see even today in Pokrovsk, Ukraine, the town in the east, which Russia has been losing up to 1,000 soldiers per day to take, one might ask, why are they fighting so hard for a town that doesn't have that much strategic value militarily? And the answer is simple. Pokrovsk, Ukraine is the largest coal mine in the country. And it's very important to have that coal in order to produce steel, which used to be a third of all of Ukraine's exports. Now, by taking that mine, and let's imagine it's in Russian hands, it means Ukraine's coal production per year would drop from about 7 million metric tons to about 2.5 or 3 million metric tons. Russia, by comparison, has about 12 million metric tons per year of production. Now, steel is one of the very few industries that the European Union has not really been dying to put a lot of sanctions on. And the reason is that Europe buys a lot of steel from Russia. So if Russia is able to make Ukraine no longer competitive, is if Ukraine doesn't have enough coal, they would have to import coal. And if it imports the coal, the steel then becomes too expensive to sell in the market. But by cornering the market, by making sure that it's not possible for Ukraine to compete, it allows Russia to compete within Europe. And that's what Russia's goal here is. Once again, it's economics. And it's not even for the Russian state. Ultimately, it's going to be oligarchs in Russia who gain from this. But Putin is keen to keep them happy in order to make sure they stay aligned with him.
This also, I guess, brings up an interesting theory that I read at the start of the war, and it was more like Russia just couldn't see all these post-Soviet countries move towards Europe, because we have seen with, especially with Poland, where the economic growth that they've had over the last decade is like unbelievable. And if Ukraine starts growing like that, the Russian people will look at their border and see basically what we had in the Soviet era, where you look across the border in West Germany, and it was so much better. The lives were so much better, and that's something I guess Russian leaders cannot afford, since they know any country that moves west will have better economic prospects.
Absolutely, Case. I agree with you. The fact is that Russia itself doesn't want its population to realize how much better things are where there's not Russia. So when you look out and you can see that the former Soviet republics, specifically the Baltic states, are examples, have all joined the European Union. They're members of NATO, and they're prosperous. They're successful. Their people are happy. Their quality of life has continued to improve year after year. The average Russian can't say the same thing for himself. In fact, the average European spends about 15% of their income on food. The average Russian spends more than 50% of their income on food. The average Russian is quite impoverished. And now that the economic circumstances inside of Russia, things are going to get even worse. And the key part is the Kremlin really has no ability to make the lives of their citizens better. Because at this point, the systematic corruption, the entire system upon which Russia is built in such a way that it cannot change. And that's why dictatorships fall, is because simply they are not able to adapt to change. So I think that going ahead, Russia's going to have more and more problems keeping their population happy, especially when they can look elsewhere and see that the world can really be a better place if you don't have bad leaders like Russia does.
But in Soviet era too, and even now, the one thing Russia at least was able to offer to its allies was military support, the weapons and stuff. But recently, that may hurt their reputation, especially after the Israeli strike in Iran, where Russian air defenses, it seems they weren't even able to detect F-35s. That I guess shows the technological difference. How big of an impact is that going to have on like Russia's reputation and just Russian allies buying their
Well,
equipments?
Russia's reputation, I think, globally is taking a huge blow. Militarily, at this point, it's very clear that Russia is unable to complete the full scale invasion of Ukraine. Now, imagine Ukraine, today, a country with a population that lives in the free part of the country of perhaps 25 million people or so. Russia's got 140 million people, and it can't finish the job. And that shows that Russia's military obviously has some very significant problems. But as far as technology goes, we've seen clearly in the war in Ukraine that Western technology is far, far superior than anything that Russia has. And the technology that's been given to places like Iran, such as the air defense, simply doesn't work the way that Russia had promised that would work. So I think Russia's going to have harder and harder times finding buyers for the military hardware that they put out. It's Russia is simply not competitive in a modern economy.
What about what does the Israeli strikes say about the Iranian military? Is that something you want to talk a little bit about? Because
So I think at this point it's very clear to Iran's leadership they overplayed their hand, and I think they believe their own propaganda for far too long that they were this strong country that they destroy Israel, and we see that it's not really nearly as simple as what they thought it was going to be. Going ahead, though, we see that now that Hezbollah has been wiped out, it's going to be harder and harder for Iran to be able to exercise the amount of influence it had in the region. Obviously, it's still a very important country in the region, but it, like Russia, has faced significant setbacks. And both those countries now realize that their militaries are not the source of great pride that they thought that they were. And so we can only hope that maybe the North Koreans soon will also share that fate.
also another big escalation, at least I would call it, is Russia helping Houthis with satellite data to strike civilian ships. I wonder if that's. It seems like we learned so much about the Russian stuff. I guess it's also the government doesn't want to react based on reports from news organization, but it's like the North Korea stuff happened, and now this is like, is there going to be like a harsher response from the West?
Russia has been found to be assisting the terrorists attacking shipping routes that hurts Western commerce, specifically because they are helping the Houthis and other terrorist organizations. Now, Russia's not shy about working with terrorists. It's done that for a long time. You remember just a couple of days after the October 7th attacks in Israel, the Hamas leadership went to Moscow for consultations with the government there. Hezbollah is obviously very close, one can say, with the Iranian government, and Russia has no problem working with them too. But in this current case, we see that Russia is continuing its asymmetrical warfare against the West by assisting terrorist organizations to attack Western interest and financial interest in the Middle East. The objective is to cause pain and to create more chaos. But I think because the West is so far superior to Russia's capabilities, the West will be able to, one, track down the Houthis and to also expose further the connections that they have to Moscow.
Talking about asymmetric warfare, it seems Russia is really good at information warfare, and it seems like we're just playing catch up, especially in the West. It's like they spread something, and then the agencies here try to like debunk it. It's explained to public that it's fake, it's coming from Russia. But by that time, Russia has moved on to something new, and that's spreading on social media. Like, how big of an impact is that having on our elections, and how much is that helping Russia?
So Russia came to a conclusion a while back, and it was a very, very smart conclusion. They realized that whenever you get into battle, you want to choose the terrain where the battle's fought. You don't want your enemy to choose how the war is going to be fought. So if there's going to be a conflict with NATO, they realize that conventional warfare is not going to work out well for them because American technology versus Russian technology is night and day. But where they could be competitive and where they do want to have the war is in the information space. So we see that Russia has continued to use its propaganda, which is certainly influencing elections, but also stirring tensions, ethnic, religious, and other, across Europe and across the US, Canada, and we also know in Africa and Latin America. Now, this is very inexpensive, and it's also unlikely to be punished. If Russia were to directly attack, let's imagine, a NATO capital, they can be absolutely certain there would be a very harsh military response almost immediately. But if you just are able to manipulate the elections in a different country, it's very cheap, one. But two, you're never really going to get punished because who's really going to start World War III over something that happened on the internet? But the chance is nobody's really going to go for them. So then they know that they can continue working with rogue actors, as well as with hackers, as well as with propagandists to influence what happens in the West and really to face no repercussions.
Also, the election meddling, I guess that's not just limited to West, because I'm sure you've seen the Georgian election that just ended, and there's a big controversy that's going around about the results and how pro-Russian party won, even though the exit polls showed something else. How do you think that will play out?
So, in both the case of Moldova and Georgia, we see that Russia was trying to influence the outcome of the elections. Now, in the case of Georgia, there are protests that are already starting, and the opposition has refused to accept the election results. Moreover, even the president of Georgia has said that the election results were falsified and blamed Russian actors for being behind it. So, Russia is definitely a nefarious actor and realizes that democracies are a huge window of opportunity. One, because you can try to steal the elections, as they did in Georgia. But secondly, it allows you to stir a lot of debate, which they can turn towards hatred. So people start to no longer talk about the election, but to hate each other and to be divided. For Russia, in a lot of elections, who ultimately wins is not as important as what impact it will have on the society as a whole. So they can use the elections to further shatter the population so that citizens of one country no longer feel united. That's already a victory for Russia.
Is there any possibility that Russia will ever pick a war with NATO?
Russia would be unwise to pick a war with NATO because simply it realizes it wouldn't win. If they can't win in Ukraine, being able to win against NATO is just totally unrealistic. But that's conventional warfare. As far as it goes in general, would Russia pick a war with NATO? I think that Russia is at war with NATO. Russia today is actively waging war against NATO and NATO countries' influence globally. But unfortunately, our leaders are unwilling to say that publicly. They recognize what's going on. They can see what Russia is doing in Africa, Latin America, Asia, and obviously in Ukraine. But they are unwilling to say that Russia is at war because that means there should be a very strong response. And they're hoping that just being quiet about it and not making a big deal, Russia will start to behave well and won't create any more problems, which is absurd. Someone like Vladimir Putin, it only feels emboldened when he sees that the West's red lines mean nothing. And that actually will push him to do more and more aggressive actions against Europe and the United States because we have refused to stand up to him.
Also, the BRICS summit just happened. I know that's not like the counter to NATO, it's more of an economic grouping. But what were like the big takeaways from what just happened?
So Russia dreams of BRICS as becoming a counter to NATO and be sort of like the European Union amongst those countries. But the fact is, it's never going to develop to be that. And there's a lot of reasons. First and foremost, most of the countries within BRICS do more trade with the West than they do with the other BRICS countries. So, simply economically, it makes much more sense to not be exclusively stuck with other countries that are also developing. Russia is also hoped that he could convince bigger countries like China to dump the US dollar or to do things that would be ultimately detrimental for the Chinese economy. And China has consistently, for years, refused because China, of course, is always going to operate in its national interest first and foremost. So Russia does try to cajole the other BRICS countries to join them in jumping off the bridge, but it seems so far they've been pretty unsuccessful.
Perfect. Thank you so much, Jason, especially coming on since you're sick. I really appreciate it, and I'm sure the audience will appreciate it. And personally, I couldn't recommend your channel more. I learned new stuff that I don't learn on other channels, especially traditional media. So I'm gonna link it here and in the cards above. So I highly recommend you guys check it out and give him a subscribe.
Thank you so much. I appreciate it.